The year was 1566, and behind the ornate walls of Topkapi Palace, 16-year-old Princess Mihrimah Sultan stared at her reflection in a mirror of polished silver. Tomorrow would bring her wedding day, a celebration that would echo through the marble corridors of the Ottoman Empire's most magnificent palace. But tonight, as servants bustled around her chambers preparing silk gowns and precious jewels, terror consumed her thoughts. For Ottoman princesses, marriage was not a fairy tale. It was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver that would strip away their power, their freedom, and in many cases, their very identity. What awaited these daughters of sultans was not romantic bliss, but a systematic dismantling of everything they had known. The wedding night itself represented just the beginning of a transformation so complete, so devastating, that many princesses would spend their remaining years plotting ways to reclaim what had been taken from them. Tonight, we're pulling back the silk curtains of history to reveal why the most privileged women in the Ottoman Empire lived in absolute dread of their wedding ceremonies. The popular imagination, shaped by romanticized tales of exotic harems and fairy tale weddings, has created a fantasy version of Ottoman royal marriages. But the reality was far more sinister than any Hollywood production would dare portray. These were not unions of love, but calculated exchanges of human currency designed to strengthen political alliances and expand imperial influence. The princesses understood this brutal truth from childhood. They were assets to be traded, not daughters to be cherished. To understand the full horror of what these young women faced, we must first examine the world that created such a system. The Ottoman Empire at its height stretched across 3 continents, controlling trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and Africa. This vast realm required constant negotiation, alliance building, and strategic marriages to maintain its delicate balance of power. At the center of this web sat the Sultan, absolute ruler of millions, whose daughters became living diplomatic treaties. Ottoman princesses occupied a unique position in Islamic society. Unlike their counterparts in other Muslim empires, they wielded considerable influence within the palace walls. They received extensive educations, commanded their own households, and often advised their fathers on matters of state. Some even controlled vast fortunes and charitable foundations. This power, however, came with a terrible price. They were never truly free to choose their own destinies. The selection of a husband for an Ottoman princess followed a calculated process that reduced human beings to political chess pieces. The Sultan and his advisors would identify potential candidates based purely on strategic value. Military commanders who needed rewards for loyalty, provincial governors requiring closer ties to the capital, or foreign dignitaries whose allegiance could secure important trade agreements. Love, compatibility, or even basic human decency played no role in these decisions. Once a match was decided, the princess had no recourse. Refusal was not an option. Protest could result in exile or worse. The young women learned early that their feelings, their preferences, their very humanity mattered less than the empire's political needs. They were expected to smile graciously, express gratitude for the honor, and prepare for a life that would bear no resemblance to the privileged existence they had known. The engagement period became a time of mounting dread as princesses received detailed reports about their future husbands. Palace spies would provide information about the man's character, his other wives, his financial situation, and most terrifyingly, his treatment of women. Many Ottoman officials practiced polygamy, meaning the princess would not even have the questionable comfort of being her husband's only wife. Instead, she would enter an existing household where established wives viewed her as a threat to their own positions and their children's inheritance rights. These reports often revealed disturbing details that would chill any young woman's heart. Stories of husbands who beat their wives, who squandered their dowries on gambling or military campaigns, or who treated their royal brides as mere symbols of status rather than human beings. The princesses learned about cramped provincial palaces, Far from the luxury of Topkapi, where they would spend their remaining years in relative isolation, perhaps most devastating was the realization that marriage would sever their connection to the source of their power, proximity to the Sultan. Once they left Constantinople for their husband's domain, they became subject to his authority rather than their father's protection. The influence they had wielded as unmarried princesses evaporated the moment they spoke their wedding vows. They transformed from powerful political players into dependent wives whose value lay primarily in the prestige their bloodline brought to their husband's reputation. The wedding preparations themselves became exercises in psychological torture disguised as celebration. Servants would discuss the bride's beauty, her valuable dowry, and the honor being bestowed upon her future husband, while the princess sat in silence, knowing she was being packaged like precious cargo for shipment to a foreign court. The elaborate ceremonies, the expensive gifts, the congratulations from visiting dignitaries, all of it served to emphasize her powerlessness in the face of imperial politics. As the wedding night approached, experienced palace women would provide the bride with advice that ranged from practical to deeply disturbing. They spoke of submission as virtue, of endurance as duty, and of acceptance as wisdom. These conversations revealed the harsh reality that awaited even the most privileged women in Ottoman society. Complete subordination to male authority, regardless of their royal blood or previous influence. The most chilling aspect of these preparations was the systematic conditioning designed to break the princess's spirit before she even entered her new home. Palace advisors would explain how her behavior would reflect upon her father's honor and the empire's reputation. Any sign of unhappiness, any hint of rebellion, any failure to appear completely devoted to her new husband would be interpreted as disloyalty to the Sultan himself. The weight of imperial expectations became a prison more confining than any physical chains. Historical records reveal the desperate measures some princesses took to avoid their fate. Princess Gaverhan Sultan reportedly fell mysteriously ill on 3 separate occasions when marriage proposals were presented, leading court physicians to declare her too frail for matrimony. Others embraced extreme religious devotion, hoping to convince their fathers that they were called to spiritual rather than earthly service. A few even attempted to influence the selection process by secretly communicating with potential candidates, though such behavior risked severe punishment if discovered. The palace became a stage where these young women performed elaborate charades of gratitude and excitement, while privately experiencing terror that consumed their every waking moment. They learned to smile when discussing their future husbands, to express enthusiasm for leaving their childhood homes, and to project an image of eager anticipation for their wedding nights. This constant performance of false emotions added another layer of psychological torment to an already unbearable situation. Court records document the physical toll this emotional strain took on the princesses. Many experienced dramatic weight loss, chronic insomnia, and mysterious ailments that palace physicians struggled to treat. Modern medical analysis suggests these symptoms were consistent with severe anxiety disorders and depression, understandable responses to the complete loss of control over their own lives. Yet the Ottoman court interpreted such suffering as evidence of feminine weakness rather than natural human responses to impossible circumstances. The wedding night itself loomed as the final transformation, the moment when a powerful Ottoman princess would become merely another wife in a provincial household. Everything they had worked to achieve, every relationship they had cultivated, every dream they had nurtured would be sacrificed on the altar of imperial politics. Their terror was not simply about physical intimacy with a stranger, but about the death of their former selves and the birth of a diminished existence they were powerless to prevent. As we prepare to examine the devastating reality of what happened once these marriages were consummated, remember that behind every strategic alliance and political calculation was a young woman whose life was forever altered by forces completely beyond her control. The Ottoman Empire's greatest diplomatic tools were also its most tragic victims. The wedding ceremonies themselves became elaborate theaters of deception, where the empire's most powerful families gathered to witness what they believed was a joyous union. Golden candles illuminated vast halls filled with the empire's elite, their silk robes rustling as they whispered about the bride's beauty and the groom's fortune. Musicians played traditional melodies, while servants carried trays laden with delicacies from across the known world. But beneath this veneer of celebration lay a transaction as cold and calculated as any military campaign. The ritual began with the formal presentation of the dowry, a display of wealth so magnificent that visiting dignitaries would report its splendor to courts across Europe and Asia. Chests overflowing with gold coins, precious gems that caught the light like captured stars, and silk fabrics so fine they seemed woven from moonbeams. This treasure represented not generosity, but payment, the price the Sultan paid to secure political loyalty through his daughter's sacrifice. Princess Mihrimah Sultan's own wedding provides a haunting example of this spectacle. Contemporary accounts describe how she was adorned in robes encrusted with diamonds and emeralds, her hair braided with pearls that had been harvested from the depths of the Persian Gulf. Yet witnesses noted something troubling in her demeanor, a distant look in her eyes that suggested her spirit had already begun to withdraw from the proceedings. The young woman who had once debated philosophy with court scholars and advised her father on matters of state now sat in silent submission as her future was sealed by ceremonial vows. The groom's arrival marked the beginning of the princess's final hours as a member of the imperial household. These men often appeared in their finest military dress, their chests decorated with medals earned in campaigns across the empire's expanding borders. They carried themselves with the confidence of conquerors, which in a very real sense they were, about to claim their most valuable prize. The princesses were required to greet these strangers with smiles and words of welcome, even as their hearts filled with dread about what the coming hours would bring. What made these moments particularly cruel was the performance of consent that Ottoman protocol demanded. The princess had to publicly declare her willingness to marry, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd as she spoke the words that would bind her to a stranger forever. This false choice became a form of psychological torture. She possessed the physical ability to refuse, but knew that doing so would bring catastrophic consequences for herself and potentially her entire family. The religious ceremony that followed represented the final severing of the princess's connection to her former life. Islamic marriage contracts were read aloud in Arabic, their legal language transforming a human being into property with the stroke of a pen. The bride's signature, applied with trembling hands, legally transferred her from her father's authority to her husband's control. From that moment forward, she could own nothing, decide nothing, and go nowhere without his explicit permission. As the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the palace began to empty of guests. Relatives offered final embraces that felt like farewells to the dead, because in many ways, they were. The princess they had known, the intelligent, powerful, influential young woman, was about to disappear forever, replaced by a subordinate wife whose primary value lay in the prestige her bloodline brought to her husband's household. The tradition of escorting the bride to the bridal chamber created one final opportunity for the princess to contemplate her fate. Palace women, many of whom had endured similar experiences decades earlier, formed a procession that moved slowly through the corridors where she had once walked as a free person. Their songs spoke of happiness and fertility, but their eyes often revealed understanding of the terror their young charge was experiencing. The bridal chamber itself had been prepared according to customs designed to emphasize the bride's new status. Rose petals scattered across silk sheets, burning incense that filled the air with cloying sweetness, and mirrors positioned to reflect candlelight in dancing patterns across the walls. These romantic touches served to mask the harsh reality of what was about to occur, the physical consummation of a political arrangement that reduced a human being to a diplomatic tool. Historical records reveal the desperate strategies some princesses employed to delay or minimize their ordeal. Princess Fatma Sultan reportedly consumed a mixture of herbs that made her violently ill on her wedding night, forcing postponement of the consummation for several days. Others feigned religious visions or claimed to have received divine messages requiring periods of purification. These tactics provided only temporary respite, but for women facing complete powerlessness, even brief delays felt like victories. The husband's arrival in the bridal chamber marked the moment when theory became brutal reality. These men, often decades older than their teenage brides, approached the encounter with expectations shaped by their absolute authority over women. They had purchased the right to this princess through their service to the empire, and they intended to claim what they believed they had earned. The young woman's feelings, fears, or physical comfort were irrelevant to this transaction. What followed behind closed doors remains largely undocumented, but the aftermath spoke volumes about the trauma these women endured. Palace physicians were frequently summoned to treat mysterious ailments that appeared in the days following royal weddings. Symptoms included severe depression, loss of appetite, and physical injuries that were diplomatically attributed to wedding night clumsiness rather than their more sinister causes. The silk curtains of history have revealed a truth that shatters every romanticized notion of Ottoman royal life. These princesses, born into unimaginable privilege, discovered that their greatest blessing became their most terrible curse. Their wedding nights were not celebrations, but executions of the spirit, transforming powerful young women into diplomatic pawns through systematic psychological and physical subjugation. Behind the golden facade of empire lay human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. The next time you hear tales of exotic palaces and fairy tale marriages, remember the voices history tried to silence, the daughters of sultans who paid the ultimate price for their fathers' political ambitions.